of mass atrocities in many parts of the world. The crises and challenges arising from climate change, including the dramatic widening of inequality caused by climate emergencies, environmental degradation, and the political manipulation and weaponization of access to scarce resources, all pose a threat to vulnerable societies, creating an environment which is conducive to the commission of atrocities. Through extensive research across multiple fields of study, as well as annual discussions at COP climate change conferences, the international community has developed numerous strategies to adapt and respond to current and future climate change threats. However, atrocity prevention and directly responding to climate-related atrocity risks have been largely absent from these spaces and discussions. Today, we aim to bridge this gap by having a concrete conversation with experts working at the nexus of climate change, security, and finance to highlight situations where climate-related atrocity risks are already present and to discuss strategies to ensure international efforts more holistically respond to such risks and better protect populations vulnerable to atrocities and climate emergencies. Folks, we have approximately 1 hour for the discussion today. You can follow us on X at GCR2P. If you want to participate in the discussion, please tag us in your comments. A recording of this event will be available at the Global Center website later today. But before we start the discussion, I would like to give the floor to our co-host, the European delegation to the United Nations, and our colleague there, Simone Schuller. Simone, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Savita. Good morning or good afternoon to all of you. My name is Simone Schuller. I cover human rights, including R2P, at the EU delegation to the United Nations in New York. I'm standing in today for my Deputy Ambassador, Hedda Sampson, who unfortunately fell sick and is sending her apologies for not being able to be with us. So on her behalf and on behalf of the European Union, I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this event organized by the Global Center, which will give us a great opportunity to reflect on the links between climate change and mass atrocities. Thank you all for your interest. The EU is a staunch supporter of the responsibility to protect and atrocity prevention. We promote R2P as a norm in international relations, and we prioritize conflict and atrocity prevention through tools that include our own conflict early warning system and conflict analysis screenings. We also work with international partners, including through both political and financial support to the UN Special Advisors on R2P and on the prevention of genocide and their joint office. We also work closely with civil society, so in this context, we are proud to support the Global Center in building the capacity of national civil society organizations to provide early warning on atrocity crimes, provide recommendations to the EU, the UN, and national governments, and increase our awareness and capacity, including through events like the one we're about to have today. Without doubt, climate change is one of the key challenges we face at this point in time. It will define our future, as climate change will radically change large parts of the world and make some parts even inhabitable. In many countries, the combined effects of climate change and environmental degradation are already undermining livelihoods, leading to food and water insecurity and forcing people on the move. While there doesn't seem to be a causal link between climate change and conflict, climate change is a threat multiplier. It adds to the risk of insecurity and conflict, and in turn, insecurity and conflict also make it much more difficult to react to climate change and help communities to adapt and build resilience. We can observe this dynamic across the globe in places from the Sahel all the way to the Philippines. 12 out of the 20 countries most vulnerable to climate change and least prepared for it were in conflict in 2020. This underlines how important it is to understand how these two phenomena affect and also reinforce each other. In June last year, the EU adopted a new comprehensive policy and action package focusing on the climate and security nexus. It is based on the recognition that climate change and environmental degradation are closely interlinked and mutually reinforcing, and that they are challenging peace and security. This so-called joint communication on a new outlook on the climate and security nexus, addressing the impact of climate change and environmental degradation on peace, security, and defense, is the basis for us to rethink EU external action to ensure that our activities, support, and operations are resilient and that they respond to the growing threat of the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. I invite you to take a look at this document on the website of the European External Action Service. Two concrete actions we are undertaking in this regard are, on the one hand, the establishment of a climate and environment security data and analysis hub at the EU Satellite Center, which ensures that our planners and programmers have easy access to data to strengthen the security and climate-informed planning and decision-making. And on the other hand, regular climate and security dialogues and discussions at different levels with the UN, but also with other regional organizations such as NATO, the African Union, and ECOWAS. The objective here is to identify where we can work together to achieve stronger results and to learn from each other. Here at the UN, it's very important that we need to make sure that the issue of climate change and the issues of human rights and atrocity crime prevention are addressed holistically, rather than falling prey to the risk that they become competing agendas somehow. For this, a solid understanding of the linkages between the issues is of course key. So I look forward to learning more about this from our excellent speakers today, and I hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simone, and thank you for reminding us again that these are not competing agendas. And in order for us to tackle multidimensional crises, we need a holistic approach, and all norms and all normative frameworks are important in addressing these crises. So now, without further delay, we will move on to our distinguished panel. We have with us Niku Zafarnia. Niku is Bahrain and Yemen researcher in the Middle East and North Africa division at the Human Rights Watch. Tom Ellison, Deputy Director of the Center for Climate and Security, and Laura Strohmeyer, Senior Policy Advisor for Conflict, Peace Building and Good Governance at Mercy Corps. We are grateful to all of you for joining us today, and let's begin the conversation, the most interesting part of this event today. So Niku, we will start with you. We'll start with sort of looking at specific country situation, and then sort of have a broader conversation with Tom and Laura on the nexus, as well as on sort of the financing issues. So Niku, some of your work at Human Rights Watch has recently focused on how conflict in Yemen deepens the ongoing water crisis. How does climate change exacerbate conflict in Yemen, particularly in the context of the weaponization of water? What role does water scarcity and mismanagement play in intensifying tensions and hostilities within the region? Niku, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Savita. So in Yemen, I think many people are very aware of the fact that Yemen is one of the most water-poor countries in the world. And it has also been in conflict for nearly 10 years at this point. So the way that these two issues have ended up playing into one another have been quite dire and catastrophic for the country. Even prior to the current conflict, which broke out in 2014, you're looking at a country in which, conflict over water actually has been a long-standing issue and has been one of the primary drivers of conflict, mostly at a very local level across the country. But in the last few years, what we've seen throughout the conflict is that warring parties have really weaponized this lack of water and exacerbated the conflict and exacerbated the water crisis by doing things such as placing landmines near water infrastructure, attacking water infrastructure through airstrikes and through ground attacks, and just generally making it really impossible for, the limited water management that it is to actually function, making it very difficult for there to actually be, repairs made due to the blockade and the challenges of getting parts, the challenges of getting, municipal utilities to actually be able to get toward a front line where there might be water infrastructure that needs to be fixed, for example. But in terms of the ways in which climate change is really exacerbating this, I'm going to try to draw out this issue by using an example of Ma'arib, which is a city in Yemen that hosts millions of IDPs. So in Ma'arib, there's many suburbs and agricultural lands that surround the city. And in these areas, there was, an offensive a few years back in which the Houthis, when they were leaving land, would surround land and particularly people's farmland with landmines. As flooding increased thanks to climate change in large part, there's always been flooding in Yemen. I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying it's all climate change, but it has become much more drastic in the last few years. Flooding would carry a lot of those landmines into people's land further in where they weren't able to see it, and sometimes directly into people's homes. And in many cases, displaced entire families and communities due to the fact that they were no longer able to farm on their farmland because of these landmines. And so this combination of a conflict issue and the fact that there was climate change and more increased flooding drove a lot of people into Madib, in addition to many other displaced people who were living in this land. But Madib used to be a city that just hosted a few 100,000 people, around 300,000 people. And now it did not have like a setup or infrastructure that was able to manage having several 100,000, if not more than 1 million people enter the city. At this point, I think over 2 million people enter the city. There was no water structure and sewage structure because people managed through a combination of wells and individual sewage holes. So what this has meant is that IDPs who have come in have ended up digging individual holes for themselves, both for sewage and for water, infiltrating the water, the water supply and the groundwater that existed in the area, and making a massive, massive problem that already existed in Madib significantly more extreme. It also means that it's led to conflicts between local groups and the IDP groups versus the local community that already existed there, over the fact that their resources are being depleted by this incoming of hundreds of thousands of people. So I think this is one very clear demonstration of the fact that climate change and conflict have come together to create another conflict driver, which is displacement and resources. A lack of resources, another major conflict driver, and conflated into one city to exacerbate a lot of existing problems to begin with and drive further conflicts.
No, thank you for that, Nico, and thank you for sort of linking all of these different aspects of circumstances and happening within a particular conflict setting, within a particular country, and sort of then coming up with the answer that it's not just one. Each displacement is driven by conflict, and then the conflict exacerbates climate scarcity, and then water scarcity has always existed in Yemen. So that's really an important example for us to think about when we're having this discussion between the nexus between climate and security, that there are all of these factors which are coming together. It's not a linear relationship, it's a circular relationship with different factors exacerbating each other. So now we move to Tom. Tom, the Center for Climate and Security has been spearheading a concept referred to as the responsibility to prepare and prevent. And I really like that because we work on responsibility to protect, which aims to systematically address climate security risks at the national, regional, and international level. In your view, how can this concept and R2P complement one another in preventing and responding to climate-related risk factors for atrocities?
Hi, thank you for having me and for that question. So I'll briefly give a summary of the responsibility to prepare and prevent, and then I'll kind of tie it into our discussion here today. So the responsibility to prepare and prevent is a framework that was proposed by our organization's founders, Caitlin Werrell and Francesco Femia. So I can't take personal credit for it, but I invite the audience to look it up and read further if they're interested. But in brief, obviously, it's in the name, it takes a little bit of inspiration from the R2P framework and says that with regards to systemic risks like climate change, especially climate change, with unprecedented foresight about that risk and an unprecedented type, degree and type of risk, we have a commensurate responsibility to prepare for and prevent it, right? So by that, I mean, climate change is really an unprecedented risk to a whole host of sectors, right? Being a transnational phenomenon that threatens states and communities' most basic needs and systems. And it's a variable that hasn't really been changed in the way that we're currently changing it. So it upends a lot of our assumptions based on past precedent about politics and governance and conflict. At the same time, we have this sort of unprecedented foresight about climate change when we think about it in comparison to a lot of other forces that shape conflict or atrocity risk or other issues that we work on. In some ways we have the luxury that climate change, there are uncertainties certainly, but we have quite a bit of insight and foresight and advanced notice and precision about what we can expect with climate change under different emission scenarios. And the fact that even if we were to hit the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, which we're quite a ways off from, even in that very optimistic scenario, we would face increased warming for the next couple of decades. And we're on track for significantly more than that. So when we think about that level of foresight in comparison to the very unpredictable and complex factors that are at play in foreign policy and conflict and other things, right? Things as mercurial as, you know, Vladimir Putin's mindset on any given day, that's actually quite a high level of foresight and advanced warning. And at the same time, we have quite a bit of, you know, a better ability than ever before to monitor and model and analyze the conflict and security and violence dynamics that go along with that. So those things combined sort of compel us to act in a way to prepare for how climate change is going to shape all these other risks we face. And that means a whole host of things that we'll discuss further in our conversation today, but you know, building more resilient communities and security architecture, investing in vulnerable locations to prevent crises, making sure our institutions and our workforces are capable of grappling with this new type of challenge. So that's sort of in summary, the responsibility to prepare and prevent framework. And we think about that with R2P, they're really quite complementary, because when we think about it, at least from my perspective, in the framework of climate and security issues, right, mass atrocities are really sort of a subset of the most catastrophic among the kind of larger set of potential negative interactions of all those things that we're looking to prevent or mitigate. So when we think about, you know, atrocity risk factors and how climate change can directly or indirectly affect them, the two that come to the forefront are existing conflict and polarization or exclusionary ideologies, right? And we have a lot of examples and work on how climate change and the response to climate change in some cases can directly or indirectly contribute to both of those things, right? So the conflict example, I won't reiterate. I think, you know, Niku gave a great example of that, but you know, a whole host of livelihoods being endangered, resource conflict, et cetera. And then on the polarization or ideology side, you know, we see examples of more maybe subtle but very still important impacts, right? When we think about, for example, how climate change can exacerbate migration and displacement, and those vulnerable populations are met with a very politicized or xenophobic response, and that can drive polarization and contribute to ideologies that can give justification to hostile action towards these vulnerable populations. So these concepts, I think, are really talking about a lot of the same things and quite complementary. And there are co-benefits to addressing these risk factors that permeate both issues.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for very clearly laying out sort of the relationship that we're trying to examine through this event. And I mean, you know, we cover around 27 countries actively right now, and in each of those countries, climate change has an effect in how resilient a community is, from Sahel and Lake Chad Basin drying up to the Horn of Africa and elsewhere. So thank you for, you know, laying out that relationship very, very clearly. Laura, on to you. Mercy Corps has recently published a piece on climate action and conflict, which identified climate finance as a key opportunity and constraint on adaptive programming in fragile and conflict-affected states. Can you provide some examples of climate adaptation financing and discuss how limited access to climate adaptation financing in conflict settings may impede community preparation and response to climate change and potentially increase vulnerabilities to atrocity risks?
Absolutely, and thanks for having us as part of this discussion. These two topics of climate change and conflict are really at the core of everything that Mercy Corps is focusing on across all of our work over the next 10 years. But in particular, we've been interested in this issue of climate finance over the last few years. There's a few reports and work from our research and programs teams, as well as a few policy roundtables with some other civil society and policymakers. So I'm building on a lot of their work here in my remarks. But overall, the key issue is that as a country is more fragile, it has a lot less climate finance, pretty drastically. So a UNDP report found that for the extremely fragile states, they each had about $2 per person in climate financing, versus non-fragile states had about $162 per person. So there's obviously just a huge discrepancy. And then, as you've heard, there's immense risks to not addressing these issues in places where they're extremely vulnerable to all of these trends, and in many cases historically have contributed the least actually to climate change and are sort of the least responsible for the current state of it. So we certainly feel like they can't be left behind. And there's a lot of reasons why climate funders are hesitant to work in these areas. As we know, they're complex. There's all of these security and other risks, but we think there's a lot of opportunities to find other ways for financing, build on a lot of the lessons of those of us who've worked in fragile and conflict-affected states for a long time, and find us new and interesting solutions to these problems. So in one of our reports in 2022, we actually looked at 4 different case studies of innovative mechanisms for potential funding. One of those that I'll focus on is actually the United Nations Peacebuilding Fund, which a lot of us know just generally as a quick, flexible funding mechanism really focused on doing what we know how to do in these very conflict-affected areas, but actually looking particularly at those projects of theirs which have a climate security angle or an environmental angle. We looked at the period of 2017 to 2021, and over that time, the Peacebuilding Fund actually had about 74 projects in 33 countries, totaling about $162 million, doing a wide range of things that could be considered climate security or integrated work. So those included things like trying to address farmer-herder conflict in the Sahel. And so the solution where there included tracking livestock migration and actually working together on the risks of that migration, or in the Pacific Islands where there's a lot of competition over some of the shrinking land masses, having communities work together on joint assessments to understand their shared risks and then using that as a base to build reconciliation. So a lot of great examples in the Peacebuilding Fund, and a lot of reasons why it worked really well is because a lot of these issues of risk and flexibility are just built in from the beginning. So they have a very high risk tolerance and appetite. They have assessment and planning for risk all throughout the process. They have some guidance already on issues like working at cross-border, kind of anticipating a lot of the issues that these programs might run into. They also systematically include local partnerships and local ownership, including in the funding, which we think is incredibly important for a lot of reasons. They also just have the flexibility built in where under a certain threshold, partners can actually make direct changes to the program without having to go through a really onerous approval process like we see in a lot of other donors. So we thought that was a really good example of just a mechanism that works well in conflict-affected areas in general, and then where they can apply that climate lens, there's a lot to learn. We also looked at some other different ideas, things like crisis modifiers. So building in a certain portion from the beginning, planning to be flexible in programs based on a reasonable assessment of risk. There are other ideas of things like peace bonds, potentially new opportunities around borrowing or maybe the private sector. And we also looked at the COVAX mechanism of actually the vaccine rollout during the pandemic, where they took sort of a countrywide approach and got actors from all across the same country kind of trying to work toward the same plan. So we think there's a lot of ideas out there in how we work in conflict, how we work in crisis, that we can very easily apply to climate mechanisms and sort of use those lessons and what we already know to bridge these two worlds together more effectively. So certainly at Mercy Corps, we've used tools like crisis modifiers, for example, in addressing drought risks in Ethiopia in 2022 as one part of our program, able to shift what we were doing and focus on that and then build that into our longer term investment on market systems development and lots of other things. So there's lots of ideas out there, and we think there's more opportunity to be creative and find joint solutions.
No, thank you for that, Laura. And I think that for the donors and member states attending the event, this is a good endorsement for the Peacebuilding Fund and its successes and its flexibility and its ability to work very holistically and comprehensively with local communities who are the most important stakeholders in adaptive strategies towards climate change. So thank you very much for that. Tom, going back to you, can you speak to the importance of establishing strong climate security governance architecture, and how can a strengthened climate security nexus enhance the international community's ability to overcome silos and address atrocity risks holistically?
Sure, absolutely. In short, it's very important. There's been quite a bit of progress in recent years on the climate security nexus in various institutions and national governments, but there's a lot more work to be done, and the coming years will be important on that front. So on the progress side, we've seen more of this in big international government organizations and national governments, this recognition and focus on the importance of climate change for security issues, and to include those atrocity risk factors we were discussing. So for example, the most recent UN Climate Summit, COP28, late last year, you had the first, what they called Declaration on Relief, Recovery, and Peace, which was sort of the first treatment of peace and security issues as part of the COP process, and had the endorsement of 82 countries and 43 different international organizations and NGOs, including ours. You've had this intersection pop up to various receptions from different countries at the UN Security Council, for example, in recent years. In the US context, the Biden administration, especially really sort of, especially at the outset, placed a very high emphasis on the intersection of climate change and broader foreign policy and security issues, with a series of executive orders and other direction to the key foreign policy and national security institutions in the United States. And then on the broader world stage too, you see issues of climate and conflict and fragility playing in more and more in things like discussions around reform of the World Bank or IMF, and how those big institutions and other multilateral development banks can reform their operations and processes to address some of the underlying climate resilience vulnerabilities. So that's sort of on the progress front, but there's still big gaps that remain, and this, even just this year, is going to be important. We have elections around the world in various forms that cover half or more of the world's population and greenhouse gas emissions, and there's still big gaps. So I mean, the first one I would point to is what related to what Laura was very eloquently describing before, but it's just the resourcing, right? That recognition has not necessarily translated into increased resourcing for adaptation or other resilience investments in these vulnerable places, especially the most conflict affected ones. As Laura was saying, the UN estimates there's still an adaptation gap between the needs and funding available for climate adaptation of close to $400 billion annually. Another big challenging gap, as we were discussing earlier, is just the geopolitics and challenges to sort of a global collective unity of effort on this topic, where when you think about the UN Security Council and any other hosts of issues, right, these climate and climate security issues are subject to the same national divides that plague those broader issues. And a few more potentially subtle ones, but I think are important, are on the information, how information is produced and consumed in different communities, and silos between those communities, right? So between the climate science and security and foreign policy community, right, those are very different communities. The security community is not one that's typically immersed in like earth science and natural sciences, and conversely, a lot of academic or scientific work in the climate space can be a little hard to digest, or maybe disconnected from the sort of timeframes and uncertainties and political realities that those security actors are dealing with. And there are still uncertainties and unpredictability and these really complex interactions and cascading impacts that we're talking about. And then more broadly, you have a lot of silos between other communities, not just scientists and security practitioners, but even in the peace and security space, right? That Declaration on Relief, Recovery, and Peace, coming from sort of more of a peace building community perspective, is still not totally in sync with how the sort of bigger national security and defense organizations think about climate and security. So there's some work to bring those into conversation with each other. There's more work to mainstream that climate consideration into the broader everyday work of people in those institutions that don't have climate in their job title, right, but are working on these various regions and conflicts. And again, across the humanitarian development and climate adaptation communities, those all have their own vocabularies and mandates and timeframes and that need to be translated across one another. And so that's why I think to include in the atrocity prevention space, has a long-standing body of work that it's really good to see through events like this, integrating and being in conversation with these broader issues, because again, so many of them overlap and influence one another.
I mean, it's amazing that 2023 was the hottest year ever since human beings started recording temperatures. And I mean, it still has not sort of brought the international community together to address a problem which, these are problems without passports. Not as one single country or one single region is going to be affected. We are all going to be affected. But you still see the siloed approach and sort of international politics still being part of it, but that doesn't go away. So Niku, again, changing gears a little bit, given the impact of climate change and environmental degradation on the water crisis in Yemen, what measures can be implemented to address both water scarcity as well as atrocity risks? And what can we learn from the situation in Yemen that can be applied to other crises with interwoven climate fragility and atrocity risk factors?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost in the context of Yemen, I might be stating the obvious here, but I think warring parties need to absolutely be protecting water rather than further destroying and attacking water. And this is, I think, particularly critical to be thinking about from an international legal lens, because although there are a lot of protections on water already, I think a lot of this could be expanded, and there should be a lot more international pressure on various warring parties and parties to conflicts, not just in Yemen, but just in general in the globe, to ensure that they're not attacking water. I think there's less emphasis placed on, infrastructure damage and destruction, even when it's critical to civilian populations versus individuals, civilians, which makes perfect sense. However, when we're thinking about a context in which people are going to be struggling for decades and generations to have adequate access to water, based on the ways that warring parties have damaged and destroyed water infrastructure throughout this conflict, there should be extreme repercussions for that, and a push from the international community for these groups to be paying reparations, ensuring rehabilitation of this infrastructure, and first and foremost protecting it to begin with. I think beyond that, there's, I mentioned this before, and we've been discussing this. There's a huge crisis of management of water in Yemen that existed long prior to this conflict. And that is one of the largest root causes for Yemen's water scarcity to begin with. And so thinking about investments and in both, resources, time, energy, just focus on rebuilding that, just the broader management infrastructure is really, really critical in both Yemen and just countries around the world, particularly countries that are under-resourced and are dealing with both conflict and water scarcity and resource scarcity more broadly. I think a lot of countries that are pouring in humanitarian aid and more urgent needs into Yemen need to also be thinking simultaneously about how to support a lot of the local efforts to bolster management of water and water negotiations. There's a lot of community-based groups all across the country that have really been fighting to get water and environmental needs on the agenda, and who know the needs of various areas far better than I do, or anyone else who's looking at the conflict from outside or at the country from outside of Yemen might know. But they often are struggling with a lack of resources and a lack of pressure to be able to place on various government officials, on various warring party officials, et cetera, that actually need to be pushed to do something. So I think really taking the lead from them, but actually ensuring that they have adequate resources and that there is real attention, pressure, and funding that goes into a lot of these management crises and gaps, and higher level infrastructure that's needed, even in the context of an ongoing conflict. I think that's really, really critical for the global community to really take a focus on, and ensure is something that's prioritized, because otherwise we're just going to continuously be attempting to address ongoing conflicts in all of these countries versus actually addressing things from the root of the problem, which has been, I think, one of the largest problems we deal with globally now and for as long as I've seen.
No, Nico, and I really appreciate your point on how, even though, Human Rights Watch and organizations like mine, we constantly cover sort of the level of civilian damage, civilian infrastructure damage, and the repercussions of that on civilian suffering. It still remains something that is not center stage. And I think that it's so important for us to have better strategies to manage scarce resources, which we are still not doing, not in Yemen and not across Horn of Africa or elsewhere. And so important, like both Laura and you raised this, that listen to the communities. They have strategies. They have been, indigenous communities know how to deal with these issues. So it's so important to listen to them to increase their resiliency, but also just to safeguard, environment and climate. So that's such an important point. Laura, in light of the observation that fragile and conflict-affected states often receive the least financing to address the impacts of climate change, what strategies or international cooperation efforts can be implemented to overcome this barrier? And how can such efforts and intervention also mitigate potential atrocity risks?
Absolutely. We think there's a lot of different recommendations and opportunities, certainly for funders. As I was discussing, I think really just learning from those who already operate in these areas. And so thinking about things like a greater risk appetite, understanding that climate adaptation is trying to address risk, and that's part of the process, and thinking about ways to build that in and learn from those experiences, just being more flexible operationally, having a trust-based partnership with the implementers and thinking about ways to embed that. As you mentioned, having those very local partnerships, learning from the communities who've been managing these systems and these resources over time and what their needs are and how to address the conflict risks at the same time, being open to being innovative and creative, and just generally being country and community centered and addressing the needs of those communities. So certainly there's lots of lessons to learn, as I mentioned, from those who are already operating there, and having that dialogue. And I think it's part of our job as those of us who are peace builders and have the skills in dialogue and in dispute resolution to sort of bring everyone to the table and have that conversation. So excited we're talking about it today. I think beyond the financing, certainly for implementers, I think there's more we can do to put out into the discussion what we know about conflict sensitivity and where that layers over to climate sensitivity. So at Mercy Corps, we've been piloting different types of assessments of actually integrating conflict and climate risks together in our assessment for our program teams and thinking about how to use those tools in a more integrated way and have them be fit for purpose for the particular situation. I think also trying to bring in more on governance. As we've heard, a lot of these both conflict issues and climate issues are often just governance issues at the very local and community level, and they have to be involved. And so I think building what we know about building that social cohesion with those groups between communities and governments, dialogue and reconciliation tools that we've had as peace builders, continuing to apply that in these areas. And don't forget about things like the private sector and other opportunities to address other issues in these areas of lack of economic opportunities or alternative livelihoods. I think there's a lot more we can be doing to bring those actors in the conversation as well. And then just finally, I think these are all of these sort of ideas are about sort of mitigating the risk and where we see these huge crises coming together of climate and conflict. But I think for us, we're trying to reframe it a bit at Mercy Corps and think also about the huge opportunity to address these crises together and find joint solutions. And it actually fits really well with everything that we do in terms of trying to address violence and conflict in these communities, in terms of thinking about joint projects, bringing conflicting communities together, working through a foundation of things like trauma healing, reconciliation, and dialogue. But then from there, being able to build on that. And we see the most success where those communities and those groups are actually able to work together or work with their local government or with new actors to be able to build something for their community that addresses a joint problem, or be able to continue to think about alternate livelihoods, new economic opportunities. So there's tons of solutions out there to actually think about these things in tandem and being more intentional. So for example, we've been working in Uganda. We have an incredible program that really revolved around trauma healing and just addressing a long history of violence in the community and sort of more recent conflict dynamics. And so it was focused on the psychosocial support aspect of it and sort of that community-based healing, addressing past conflicts, but from there, they were able to build on that and use those same groups to build out things like natural resource sharing agreements, including the local government, and then building on that to better address the water and land issues that are actually driving a lot of this same conflict. So we see opportunities in the same way to think about these issues together, working across the humanitarian development nexus and continuing to apply climate in there. I think there's a lot we still don't understand about the gender components and obviously the youth components, not just thinking about youth as sort of a marginalized population as we always do, but that youth are the most affected and will be the most affected by these trends. So how do we bring them in? So we think there's a ton of different opportunities and we have recommendations kind of for all of the actors, but I think primarily reframing our thinking a bit and seeing how we can, support these communities and all of the risks that they face, and also in being creative and finding new solutions.
No, thank you for bringing that intersectional lens. I think that's so important in how we deal with these issues and how different parts of populations face different kinds of risks. I mean, when you talk in terms of atrocity crimes itself, you constantly say that different genders experience atrocity crimes differently, and every gender's experience of atrocity crimes is different. And it's the same thing with climate change. I mean, it has gendered lines, it has lines around age and all of that, and sort of also building on this expertise that peace builders have developed over the years, and leveraging that expertise is such an important point in how we can tackle this nexus between climate and security and the conflicts that arise from that. We have some more time left, so we have one more question for all three panelists. So the final question is, what existing national and multilateral initiatives related to the mitigation of climate change can be better leveraged to address the growing threat of climate-related conflict, human rights abuses, and atrocity crimes? So who would like to go first?
I can offer a couple thoughts to start us off. I mean, I think there's a lot on the on what Laura was mentioning that I won't rehash on sort of the financial instruments and investments to improve resilience. So that's very important, but I won't belabor that point from Laura. But a few other things that come to mind for me, which are not necessarily climate explicit existing initiatives, but things that I think are applicable. I mean, one is I think on both the atrocity side and climate related security risks, there's a big mis and disinformation component to both of those. So I think tools that exist on the public diplomacy or counter misinformation front, where you've seen examples on maybe issues of COVID and vaccine related misinformation, or elections and election interference. Like, I think there are models of more proactive efforts on that front that could be applied to useful effect on these overlapping climate conflict and atrocity risk issues, and climate related misinformation, meaning more broadly than just climate denialism, but mis and disinformation and malinformation around climate effects and scapegoating of populations or of climate responses. I think another issue that's very applicable across both is the need for a more humane and flexible global migration and displacement system, right? More access to mobility when needed, and more support to receiving communities to prevent tensions from arising. And that's obviously applicable to both of those seeking safe haven or fleeing atrocities and violence, and seeking to avoid or adapt to or move away from climate hazards, which, as we've discussed, often are taking place in the same places and overlap. Another couple things that come to mind are expansion of efforts trying to, what the climate community would call sort of a just transition, or efforts to avoid unintended negative consequences or backlash, which can include security-related issues, to climate policies, right? To energy transition or climate responses. So whether that's land use conflict over increased conservation or critical minerals mining, or commodity price spikes and changes, or job losses and economic winners and losers, right? You see some of this as part of what the US has called just energy transition partnerships with particular countries in the developing world. But I think there's more thought to be given to that in this space. And then finally, I would say the field of, military exchanges, professionalization, security assistance, policy, security sector reform, I think is very applicable in both of these cases, where you have militaries are being increasingly called to be sort of the first responders by default to a lot of climate related disasters in terms of their humanitarian assistance and disaster response mandates. And we have a project where we call the Military Responses to Climate Hazards Tracker, where people can look up those responses worldwide. But those are obviously can be very, those capabilities are drawn in for a reason. They can be very rapid and life-saving. But there's also, more and less effective or potential, maladaptive ways that can go that we were discussing on more the humanitarian front more broadly earlier. And different, militaries around the world, right, obviously also have very different institutions with very different contexts and human rights records and everything else. And so with militaries also being some of the sort of most important actors or tools, both to potentially prevent mass atrocities or potentially the perpetrators of mass atrocities in other contexts, I think integrating some of these things into those activities is also worth exploring more.
And I can build on that just a little bit. I think to Tom's point on sort of doing no harm, kind of at the bigger scale, and also I think at the community level, for us making sure that adaptation projects are not inadvertently actually exacerbating conflict risk for the community, if that's somehow, giving resources to one community over another, or sort of embedding with different groups that have different tensions, making sure that that's very sensitive and responsive at the very least. But beyond that, in terms of sort of the bigger initiatives, I think Tom also mentioned this day at COP this past year that we were encouraged by, to see a sort of a specific relief, recovery, and peace day for the first time, and to have that sort of declaration. But we certainly think there's lots more to be done. I think any event that's bringing 100,000 people from around the world together has a lot of opportunity to think more about these issues and understand and learn from those local actors that are represented. And then beyond that, I think we're encouraged by things like the UN's new agenda for peace and the Summit of the Future coming up that will certainly include, we've seen where there is a recognition of sort of this intersection, but we think there's even more to be done to sort of build on that and use the power of the UN to find these joint solutions and find how these communities are actually using these tools to deepen their social cohesion and rebuild that social contract and work together. So I think we're encouraged by a lot of what's happening, but we think there's more. And I think for all sort of peace builders and climate activists to sort of consider ourselves part of the same family and the same group, trying to reduce these risks at the same time.
Oh, yeah. I'll also build on what you both have said. Thanks, Laura and Tom. I think first and foremost, I'm likely stating the obvious here, but I think in the same way that we're thinking about emissions and global emissions, and the fact that this cannot just be dealt with in a silo, and individual countries cannot just be the ones to deal with the wreckage of climate change on their countries, even if they're not the biggest global emitters. It's the same with water. And this really, really needs to be emphasized more, I think, than it already is being emphasized. There's like a combination of, yes, we need local expertise and local action, and we need to be taking the lead from people who actually understand what's going on in communities, combined with it needs to come from a higher level as well. Water can't be dealt with on only a local level, because there's only so much a group of people can do when water is a global problem, first of all, and then even at a country-based level, you're dealing with massive pieces of infrastructure and specific sources of water that are not just, extracted at a local level. They're shared by everyone. And so I think that's really the massive gap I'm seeing, is I'm seeing a lot of people in individual neighborhoods and individual communities trying to figure out their community's water needs, when ultimately, when they try to bring that up to a higher level, there's no desire to actually work on it. And sometimes that's coming from local governments but it's also coming from an international level. And, you're seeing this problem where, using Yemen as an example, it's one of many examples, right? Where you are seeing water just be depleted at a rapid rate across the country. I think back in 2010, maybe even earlier than that, the World Bank had already warned that Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, was going to run out of water by somewhere between 2020 and 2030. And we're seeing those reservoirs of water very, very quickly depleting. And we're seeing the same thing happen across the Middle East and across many other countries as well. And what will that mean other than the fact that people will then migrate, and then there will be additional pressures on other countries? And so it really is we need to deal with this as a global community and start out from this higher level, working to support people at a local level who actually understand the issues that their communities are facing. And how, this in the same way that COP is really struggling to produce the results it needs to on various levels, water really needs to be up there in one of the most, the largest priorities we can have at the moment as a global community.
No, thank you for that, and thank you for those very, very thoughtful remarks on how we can deal with this issue. And what I'm hearing from each one of you is that we need a global solutions for global problems with its heart in the local. But I mean, we have a few more minutes. So are there any final thoughts that you would like to share about your work or what you're working on, or just some recommendations? I mean, we have some time, so definitely would like to give each one of you a moment to say something, or just build upon each other's remarks.
Yeah, just appreciate so much to be part of the conversation, and certainly agree, Niku, on the significance of water. I think water security is really central to Mercy Corps' approach to addressing climate as well. And then just to say, everything that I talked about is much better outlined in some reports that are available on our website on different issues on climate finance, as well as the climate conflict nexus as well.
Tom, Niku, any final words?
Oh yeah, just thank you for having me. I would echo what was said as well. I mean, we have on the waterfront a lot of what is called alternatively, natural resource management or climate adaptation or vulnerability is really all talking about the same thing. So those are really key. Like we did some reports recently alongside climate scientists at Woodwell Climate Research Center that looked at Iran and Turkey, and so many of those issues relate to water, and not climate change is a factor on top of an already problematic, water scarcity and water management problem in both of those places. So I'm very happy to be part of this conversation. I think there's a lot more to be done across different organizations like we have represented here. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Savita, for having all of us and to chat about this really important issue. I think based on the people that are likely on this call and listening in, I really do hope that for countries that are really generally struggling to be prioritized by the global community and by international organizations and governments that have far more resources and money, I really do hope that, focusing on these long-term, broader investments, long-term solutions, and thinking about these issues at a higher, longer term level than what's currently happening is just really, really critical to moving forward. Our research on Yemen and on other countries for the last few years really just keeps belaboring this point. The fact that ultimately, we need people to really be thinking about long-term solutions with these places and not just, the immediate humanitarian need that needs to be addressed. So I really do hope that can be possible and prioritized and emphasized by international organizations and governments.
No, I mean, thank you so much for all of you and for really making these really important points. I mean, for us, this event is we've been, when you monitor countries, and Niku, you understand this. I think that the most that when you're looking at, conflict drivers and drivers for atrocity crimes, climate change has become more and more important as a factor that is exacerbating division and polarization and sort of competition and conflict. And in that context, I think for us, this is not just a conversation we are having and, it's like one and done, but this is a continuing conversation. We want to understand this better and delve into it and sort of to Tom's point earlier about breaking silos and dealing with these problems holistically. So we hope that this event is the beginning of more conversations and a better relationships between all our different organizations who are dealing with same issues but with different slant on addressing the problems. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the EU delegation for all their support, and have a fantastic day. Thank you so much. And you can find the recording of the event